Yeah, I was really excited when I heard about the off book sessions that were going to happen. When I heard about it, I was in Bogota, Colombia, actually writing a piece for my zine, and I was like in the middle of all of this ideating, and one of the pieces was centered around it was centered around this question that I was asking about where is cinema going now more and more ultimately, when if we all have phones in our pockets, which isn't necessarily a new reality, but it is a relatively new reality in comparison to the rest of the history of the medium. I was like, if we all have phones in our pockets, then really the ability to film something is not really what determines whether or not filmmaking or cinema is taking place, right? Like, it's pretty much independent of what device you are using, right? Especially even more so now with the fact that, the argument is being made that, AI can generate a movie just as well as filmmakers, which is, I'm not saying I agree with that, but I do think the question of where is cinema going, I think is more and more prescient, I think, and relevant. So it was exciting when I got this, I heard about this talk. I was like, I can share this with someone. I can share this with a group of faculty, because I don't know if this is something that people outside of film, UGF TV, relate to, but I feel like I don't get a chance to share a lot of my thoughts with the faculty. It's usually with my students, which is great, but it's interesting to kind of bounce some of these ideas off with you guys. So Homesickness is a BIPOC cinema zine that I started last year. It's in its second iteration or second kind of installation now, and the reason we use the word volume as opposed to issue is that it's really something that happens once a year, and it's basically a continuing document. It's a document that really never ends. It's just always being updated is the way that I view it. And so what I'm sharing with you guys today is sort of like what this whole project means and how it pertains to us as professors and filmmakers, but also how hopefully it can maybe inform the way that we teach, or at least it informs the way that I teach with some of the questions and discoveries that I've been making. So today's not solely about volume 2, but it's more so about, I guess, how this document, how this zine continues to evolve over time, over the years. And so first, before we kind of dive into it, I'm pretty sure the question is like, well, why homesickness? Homesickness is such a specific, notion. It's such a specific title. And I think the question, we have to refer, or at least address, why we even called it this to begin with. So my co-editor of the zine and I is a wonderful filmmaker named Kevin Xianming Yu, and when we were thinking about what we should name this thing that we wanted to do, the thing and the act, came before the title, right? And so we were like, we really want to put together a zine that maybe had essays, maybe had interviews, was just reflective of our discoveries and our, I guess you could say, our curiosities in relation to the medium. And we thought, well, what would we name it? And we thought that it should be reflective and representative of what we felt in relation to being, artists from marginalized communities or artists of color, right? And the word that we landed on, we went through many, many names, but the word that we both, when homesickness came up, we were like, oh, that is it. That is very, very similar to what we feel as artists of color creating in this medium. And I think what's good is that we didn't really know why the word resonated with us, but we knew that it did. We knew that this notion of, longing for one's home during a period of being absent from it was very pertinent and very real to both Kevin and I. So I want to read the editor's note to you guys so that we can kind of expand on what that thought process, kind of evolved into and what that feeling, developed into from homesickness. We said that homesickness is a collection of conversations and reflections that center around the idea of home. Cinema is such an elusive term, equally narrow and expansive for an ever-evolving medium. As two individuals whose professional practice is filmmaking, we view this zine as a starting point for something that can ultimately take on larger forms. As people of color, we have a complicated idea of home. Our zine is a platform for film and art that reaches towards ancestral lineages which recontextualize our present and build community across divides. I think building community across divides was very key for us because these are two photos of basically me and my brothers, and this is Kevin's family. These are two family photos. And both in New York City, one in Flushing, Queens, one in the Bronx. And I think if we were to talk about the backstories behind these photos, we realize that we have a lot more in common than we really thought that we did. And I think that sort of became an overriding almost premise for the zine, which was almost like there's so many interesting artists of color doing incredible work throughout the world. But under this kind of premise that they're like representing an entire community that doesn't get represented. But I actually think in a way, that's almost something that there's this self-siloing that's happening amongst artists of color where we think that we're alone and we think that we don't have a community. But I think it's because we're not reinforced or incentivized to find each other and to exist in the same place together, because oftentimes the grants that are given for us to make our one movie is, it's for one person, right? And it's like, this is the West African filmmaker, this is the Caribbean filmmaker, this is the, Latin American or South American filmmaker. And I feel like, almost like the idea was like, if we could have a space where people could find each other and find out their similarities, I think that would make our art even stronger, because we may be able to find ourselves in our home a little bit. We might have an easier way of finding it if we see our home in each other's art, so to speak. We see ourselves in each other's art. And so that brings us to a collective that is called Chofang 678. Chofang is what I thought, a very classic Dominican dish that I grew up eating. But it's not, apparently, because it's also a Chinese dish called cao fan. And essentially, it's basically fried rice mixed with vegetables, eggs, different, soy sauce, carrots, all this stuff. And I grew up eating it. It's one of my favorite things when my mom makes it. And then I went to Kevin's home and I see that his mom was making, Chofang. And I was like, how do you guys know how to make Chofang? They were like, well, this is cao fan. And so I do think that it was originally a Chinese dish, because if you look at the pronunciation, the spelling, it is something that originates in China, but it was something that was introduced to Dominican Republic when the Chinese came there in the early 20th century. So I think that was an interesting kind of microcosm for like the fact that this is how I think we could find ourselves. And 678 is the only parkway that you can take that connects the Bronx and Queens. Going back to building divides or breaking down divides, I think that in many publications you wouldn't think that Andrew Ahn or Aristotle Torres or Victoria Linares Villegas would exist necessarily in the same space. I think in a lot of cinema publications, they may be the one feature, or they may be one or two, right? But I think, while Victoria and Andrew probably haven't existed in any publication together, they also are two very prominent queer artists who are telling really important stories about that experience. And I thought it'd be really exciting for an interview with each of them to exist in conversation with each other. So I think that was this list right here of these filmmakers, I think is a good indication of sort of the mission statement, which is basically like finding people that actually have more in common or that are actually doing similar things with the medium that maybe they're not even aware of, right? Khalik Allah and Nelson Carlo, to me, if you look at both of their works, are actually very, very, they're as Nas said about, him and Tupac, he said they're soldiers of the same struggle. But I don't think Khalik and Nelson knew each other. And it was exciting to give them each a copy of this book and be like, you guys should look at each other's work, right? You guys are thinking about film in a very similar way. And the evidence is in the conversations. So the main thing is that everybody that gets this or that sees this is volume 1, and I can pass it around, always says this is not a zine, which I think is interesting to hear, because I kind of agree with that, right? It's like 285 pages. It's like bound like a book, right? But I think that the spirit of what it is ultimately a zine. And I think that because of the way that it started and the way that it always will continue to be, is it started as from an instinct of wanting to to engage in a certain kind of activity without knowing what the final destination was, right? We just wanted to have a point we just wanted to have a space of conversation, a space where art could be shed light upon, right? And so I think that in that sense, I like the idea that I can resist the finality of something, where like we always think that any kind of legitimate entity in this world has to exist in a perfect final form. And it's basically like, this is the publication on BIPOC cinema for this year. Like, it's like, I don't want to call it a book. I don't want to call it a magazine, because I think on the inside, it's born out of what a zine in spirit is, which is that I think it is a space of questioning. It's a space of imperfection. It's a space of a lot of contradiction. I think you have artists who don't agree with each other in that book. And I think you learn that through the conversations that we engage in. But I think to call it a book, I think, is to pretend like I've reached an answer. And I think all that it is just a space of questioning. It's a space of conversation. And so that's part of why we call it a zine, because I also think that zines should probably exist in university spaces just as much as books should. So that's why we'll always continue calling it a zine, even if it doesn't look like one. So fieldwork as conversation. That's kind of like the main premise of what I said that this whole thing was going to be. Does anybody, what do we think when we think fieldwork? What's like the first, how would you define that to be? What would you define it as? Like, do you all engage in fieldwork? Interactive. Interactive? Okay. Yeah?
Just like outside.
Right? Okay. Anybody else?
Exploratory.
Exploratory, right? So like it's like in process, you're like in search of something. Anyone else when fieldwork comes to mind? Immersive, yeah. Okay, cool. I think that, to me, we are engaging in an active fieldwork, which some say like fieldwork is like an investigative process to try to find out. You maybe have like some thesis statement or something you're trying to figure out. But I think in this case, the fieldwork that is the zine is born out of conversations that I'm doing in real time, right? So as I said, when I got the email for Off Book, I was in another country, doing the field work, right? Which was basically having conversations with artists. And I think, to me, fieldwork is it's an activity and it's a process, or it's a devotion to a process that I think it's one that shows that, or at least acknowledges that I don't have all the answers, and I don't want to have all the answers. I think that what is going to be born out of this fieldwork is going to be organic, because I don't have a predetermined, kind of outcome that I'm trying to, seek out. And so I think that the conversations that I have are basically what facilitate the fieldwork, so to speak, which is why I say that they equal each other. So this is leading to one of the major kind of themes that I want to talk about here, which is the way that it serves my pedagogical practice as a professor here in UGF-TV. This is from a conversation that I had with the multidisciplinary Pakistani artist based out of London called Raza Tariq. We were talking in Colombia, and Raza told me that film is locked in its own echo chamber, is what he said. He said that ultimately, he was speaking about the fact that he did fashion design, he did painting, he did a lot of different DJ sets as a way to kind of complement his own filmmaking, as a way to kind of invigorate the filmmaking that he did. And I was like, this idea of us being locked in our own echo chamber was really interesting to me, because I thought it actually reminded me more of my biggest fear when it comes to teaching. I feel like a lot of the time I remember when I went to film school and I was told that the low angle shot was used to kind of like frame someone that is like very powerful, and that the high angle shot is used to like put the person in, show that they're like in a very difficult, humiliating, disempowered position. And like the idea of that was interesting. But I thought what was interesting was like the professors never asked us to prove that. It was just like, this is what these angles are used for, and like basically go ahead and now use them in that way. Or what is a close-up used for? What is a wide shot used for? I think the proof is oftentimes in the work, but I think when I saw that, I was like, man, I don't know if I want to go to the professor to give me the answers, because I want to go and watch the actual film or see what the filmmaker said about why they use this angle. And so this is testing the validity of my own teachings. And so I think that's one thing that I'm always trying to figure out in the classroom, is I'm very hesitant to sort of give prescriptive answers to any kind of way of doing something in filmmaking, because I do feel like the only way that we test any kind of truth within the medium is to basically be out in the field and see what's actually happening, right? And so maybe the way that close-ups were used before are not the same way that close-ups are used today, right? And so for me to just kind of hold on to the one lesson I learned, or a few lessons that I learned about from Alexander McKendrick or Akira Kurosawa about how they use certain, visual techniques, and just extending that, I think actually just makes us all listen to each other. We're just trying to get affirmed by what we want to hear. It's actually similar to how we are on our cell phones a lot of time with like the algorithm, where we kind of are hearing and seeing what we want to see, but we may not be testing the validity of these things. And so this is a visual guide that I made in Sight and Sound Filmmaking. And I remember I was working through this visual guide, and I was trying to basically give the students all the basic kind of grammar of like film, and like why a close-up is used and things like that. But then at the same time, I had just published the cover article for American Cinematographer magazine. And I remember that the DP for the film The 800, which is the first IMAX film to be shot in China, talked about why they used a single camera. And he said this, he said, the biggest drawback of multi-camera shooting is that the more you shoot, the more you want to cover all the action from every angle. In the end, you lose the film's focus and voice without that. The film has no spirit, no identity. Setting limits amid an abundance of resources was key in his attempt to have the audience's eyes be restricted, their vantage point limited. This creates a more real-life immersive experience. Now, I shared this as optional reading in my Sight and Sound class. This was required reading. This guide that I spent all this time going through. I think it's like 38 pages or something. But this article was actually much more resonant for the students than the guide that I had put together, thinking like, okay, I was an adjunct at the time. I was like, I'm a film professor. I have to tell them everything that essentially you're supposed to know when you're gonna study film, right? They were sophomores. But this article, which was one that was about the first IMAX film that was shot in China, which was a very new in-process thing, resonated a lot more with the students. And so one of my students, Hank Johnstone, really strong student, started to do this thing in his production books, which I didn't ask him to do. But for all of his production books, there was a list of rules, and there was the reasoning behind the rules. And then I asked him, where's that instinct coming from? And he said, well, that article that you showed us, it was really cool. He had these like formal parameters, like these reasons for, it was an $80 million budget film, and he decided he was going to use a single camera because of the specific intent behind that, right, which we looked at in the article. And so it was really interesting to see, look at these rules. It says like, use only the 85 millimeter lens. Use no more than one wide shot. The rest of the shots must be close-ups. No smoking cigarettes on camera, whatever it may be. But then under that, you have these reasons for each of those. And I think that it's not a coincidence that Hank was making some of the strongest films in the class, because I think he was drawing from these kind of rules that this cinematographer in the field was putting into practice. And that was like a real, I don't believe in aha moments, but that was an aha moment. Because I was like, I need to create as many opportunities for this kind of discovery to happen in the classroom, which means that I don't have all the answers, but I need to go out and find them all the time. Basically, which is pretty easy because I like to just talk to people and hang out. And so that's the zine. These is just me sitting at a cafe, right? It's like, it's on paper, but it's not like, it's just documentation of conversations. And so I feel like this has become what the fieldwork is. This is what the conversations are, right? And that's why I said that it's conversations as fieldwork, because the way that I'm testing any of my knowledge in the field as a filmmaker is not just through my own filmmaking, but it's also through what my peers are doing, so that then we can inform our students in the best way possible. The way that I think is also a way for us to remain kind of in conversation with the medium, which changes rapidly all the time, right? New films come out, and then all of a sudden there's a new, kind of rule, or a new, established kind of theme. So I want to share some interesting findings from Andrew's interview. Because one of the really exciting things about how we teach our students at UGF-TV is we teach them to really dig into the personal a lot of the time. We really teach them to kind of, explore and express from a personal perspective. And I think that resonated with me. I think that does help filmmakers, but I think that we don't talk as much about the cost of that, right? Andrew Ahn, probably the leading Asian American queer filmmaker today, just remade, Ang Lee's The Wedding Banquet. He came to the world through his 10-minute Sundance short, which is called Dull, First Birthday, which is about him coming out, right? It was his way of coming out to his parents. So he hadn't told his parents that he was gay, right? But through this film, where he casts his family and puts on this production, this was the way of him coming out and saying, hey, this is my experience, this is what I'm going through, I'm going to show you better than I can tell you. And I thought that was so inspiring. I was like, wow, that's incredible. Like, my students need to read this. Like, this is what it is. But then in the same interview, Andrew also said, but I don't think that everyone is ready to do that. He said, sometimes things are a little bit too hot and you need to let them cool off before you can touch them. And so sometimes it can be re-traumatizing to dig from such a personal place. And I thought that was really interesting to kind of like question, like almost like to test or push against this idea that like, if the work is great and we had to do whatever we had to do to get it made, that's enough. That means that we're doing our job as artists. But are we taking care of ourselves, right? And I think more and more, it was exciting to see that a filmmaker out in the field is actually thinking about how to develop a practice, how to be a conscientious and like healthy person as an artist, right? And to have a practice that maybe doesn't hurt you in sacrifice for the art, which I thought was really interesting. On more of a craft level, I think our film professors will be interested in this. The film is shot entirely on sticks. And I remember we asked them, how did you arrive at this, idea? What were you thinking? Was it, analyzing the character and what was the reason for why you shot it this way? And Andrew said something very interesting. He said, we were at the final stages of casting and it was between two actors. And I asked the DP came to me and said, he asked the DP, how will we shoot this? And the DP was like, well, if you cast this actor, we'll shoot it handheld because of the energy that this actor has. They just have, we have to move with them within the frame. But if you choose this other actor, I would be entirely, on sticks the whole time still because this actor has such a stoic, kind of presence to them. And I think that was such a fascinating look into why you would even shoot a certain way, because I've never heard casting being what informs the way that we are ultimately going to shoot a film or the way we're going to direct a film directorially. It's usually like what the character is feeling, which is all true. But again, like if a student told me this in class, I might be like, well, are you sure? Like, I don't think that's what it is. But actually, a filmmaker was in the process of doing it, and now I learned that maybe, factoring some of these considerations into casting or like in relation to casting can actually inform how we shoot. So again, it's like seeing what else is on the table, right? As opposed to thinking that I know all the answers, because there's just no way that I do. Ekwim Sangi, who made the great film Farewell Amour, which is on Criterion, she talked about creating a playlist for every character, which I think was really exciting. So in my advanced class, our students all created a playlist for their films to kind of like guide them through the process of writing these films, which was exciting. She did that during her writing process. So those are all Volume 1 findings, Volume 2 findings. And in the spirit of being in process, Volume 2 is not made yet, but this is like a third of Volume 2. So you can like, and it's not gonna look this bad, but it's probably the most zine version of Volume 2 that you'll see. But, so we'll do a couple of case studies. And the reason I'm showing you Volume 2 is to kind of show you some of the I guess to see some of the changes I'm seeing in the medium along the way, which is like proving kind of like what this document really serves as on a year-to-year basis. So the first study is with Garrett Bradley. Garrett has an incredible book called Devotion, which I picked up at the iFilm Museum in Amsterdam when I was screening my film this June. And Garrett talks a lot about, in this book, about images containing belief systems inherently. And there's this really great essay about, Birth of a Nation, or references Birth of a Nation, that talks about, yes, you can acknowledge, this film as basically setting up film grammar in a very fundamental way, tracking shots, cross-cutting, the use of close-ups, right? Pretty much setting the course of how we were going to even, kind of like speak film language for the next 30, 40 years. But just as powerful as those formal choices was the ideology behind how to depict black faces or black people on screen. And so there was a perpetuation of very, destructive kind of, understandings behind how to depict black people. And there was a pretty much predominant kind of approach throughout cinema, which was like, if you have a black person on screen, do not show them in close-up. I mean, that is not something that you don't want to see a black face in close-up, was something that almost became kind of a predominant kind of practice until actually Nothing But a Man, which was a wonderful film from the 60s where we actually see, black images, black faces shot in close-up for one of the first times that we'd ever really see it in cinema in that way. So Garrett talks about this idea that images contain belief systems. And one thing she says in her interview, on Intention, Future, in the Past, is she had this really great quote that I'm definitely going to ask my students literally this semester, both the freshmen that I'm teaching in art and practice, but also my advanced students, is what is it that I'm disseminating ideologically through aesthetics and through narrative? I know that we ask our students to dig deep, to be personal, to express themselves, but where are they coming from with that? Like, what are their own personal biases? What are their own class biases? What are their own racial biases, right? Like, are we asking them we're asking them, okay, to express themselves, to be personal, but what are they disseminating? What are they putting out into the world by doing so? I'm not saying they shouldn't do that, but I do think they need to engage in a questioning of asking, like, why am I casting the homeless guy in New York City and why is he black? Why am I casting, or however they're going to cast them? Why is that homeless person Hispanic or Asian or whatever they're going to cast them as? But I feel like a lot of times my students in my production classes will just make casting choices that I feel have like a certain bias behind them, but I don't know if I'm allowed to ask that. Where I'm like, I want them to ask, what ideas about the world, what ideas about culture are they embedding into their films, right? It doesn't mean that they can't go out and make them. But I do think they need to start to ask those questions, right? In the same way that Garrett Bradley, who, incredible filmmaker, is asking that about her own work, which is like, if I'm framing things in a certain way, if I'm, using music in a certain way, what are the ideas, what are the ideologies that I'm perpetuating through these aesthetics, through these narrative frameworks? So that was a key kind of discovery, a learning moment that I got through our conversation with Garrett Bradley in June of this year. So again, if we were talking March, I wouldn't have known this. But now this is going into my classroom because it's coming from Fieldwork, born out of conversations that I had, and the Zine facilitates that. The Zine allows me to escape the echo chamber and not just listen to myself. The second case study is a wonderful filmmaker named Allen Golder-Carpenter. Allen, we met in Berlin. They were making a really interesting film out there, all on Blender. And the way I defined Allen's work was kind of that it existed in multimodality, and it was almost like transmedial because it uses all these different kinds of media. And it brought me to something from Garrett's book that I want to share with you guys. She has a wonderful conversation with her mom, Susan McClelland, who's another great artist. And they're talking about the difference between film and painting. And so they were talking about the painter Bruegel, and her mom says, he allows us to view intimate human activities without obscuring or erasing anything. No cluster interrupts another. Erasure and blocking can cause anxiety. Then Garrett responds by saying, maybe that's also part of this screen problem or today problem, feeling as though we have fewer options for ways to observe and experience. Questioning if the ideas we have are really our own or just echoes of things that follow us. Going outside, getting away from the screen is radical. But what if the screen follows us? On the street, in the train? How do we go sit in a movie theater or a space and watch something after all of that? That is a new form of anxiety. And I think that's interesting, that this idea that the screens that are on our phones are following us after we disengage with them, right? How does that inform the way that we are then projecting something onto the screen? And I think that almost brings me to that other question I was asking, which is basically like, where does cinema go, right? If it can just easily exist on here, right, then this isn't really maybe what determines whether something's cinema, just the act of recording something visually, and especially if the screens are following us. So Allen talked a lot about these are two pieces that he did. So the first one he did, well, this is the film. This is a film that he's made entirely on Blender. These are 3D scans of himself, and also 3D scans of spaces. And I think it was interesting that ultimately, is this a film or is it not a film, right? It felt kind of like a Hideo Kojima, like game in a way more than anything. But he wasn't out there on set shooting anything, but he was doing 3D scans of himself in very different positions, put all that information into Blender, and now he can move the camera wherever he wants. I also think it's interesting that here is a museum piece that he put together, and I'll read to you a part of what the interview says. He says, "I wasn't always showing in galleries around the world and being able to live from my practice. I didn't always have esteem around what I was doing. When I was living in my car and stealing from the corner store, none of the people in the gallery spaces would give a shit about me. They wouldn't distinguish me from someone begging on the street. People are always nicer to you when it's your stuff on the wall. I identify more with the shoplifters than with the regular folks watching the exhibit, so I put them on the wall to explore the social architecture around surveillance and public shame." And so this, again, became, to me, a new kind of cinema, which is born out of a lot of different images of shoplifters that are posted up throughout the city, right? And then I asked him, where is the best place to project films? Where do you think the best ideal place now in this day and time is for cinema to exist? And he had a very interesting answer. He said, somewhere between the phone and the streets. I think we can just leave it there, but somewhere between the phone and the streets is interesting. That's an interesting answer. He also did an interesting performance piece where he turned he said, in London, we decided to turn an art gallery into a jail cell for a few days. And if you see, there are these two different vantage points. So one camera is the way that the state sees us, and another camera is from a flip phone that we control. So I think it's interesting to see these multiple kind of screens, and it goes back to Garrett's question about what happens when these screens, follow us after we've engaged with them. Case study number 3 is something called the Diary Filmmaker's Manifesto. My wonderful young filmmaker, Caribbean filmmaker named Garrett Lerebours. Now I want to share some of these points with you. He says, depict your surroundings, both internal and external. Become the camera. I think that's really interesting, this idea of becoming the camera. Almost like, we won't see it here, but Ramel Ross talked to us as well in this zine, and he talked about viewing the camera as an organ, as like a live, kind of like living entity. And I thought that was really interesting when you thought about this idea of Jared putting in his manifesto saying, like, one of the things is that you must become the camera as a filmmaker. Use your lens not only to create and destroy, but also to maintain and preserve. I want to use that as a jump-off point real fast to connect to this wonderful essay by the Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas, written in the early 2000s, called Junk Space. And this idea, this relationship between creativity and destruction is really fascinating to me. He says, use your lens not only to create and destroy, but also to maintain and preserve. So how could you use the lens? How could creativity lend to destruction? And I think some of the things that Rem talks about here could maybe shed light upon that. He says that brands in junk space perform the same role as black holes in the universe. They are essences through which meaning disappears. He says, Earthlings now live in a kindergarten grotesque. Junk space thrives on design, but design dies in junk space. Regurgitation is the new creativity. And so I think it's very fascinating in the sense that it is so easy to generate images, right? We could generate some images, all of us, right now in ChatGPT. So it is interesting to think about this increased level of creativity maybe actually not being something that is formative, or maybe like adding something to the world. It actually might be destroying something, right? Or destroying our overall aesthetic. I'm not sure I agree with that fully, but I do think that recontextualizing or reassociating creativity with something that is maybe just not objectively great, right? It's not enough just to create. It's not enough just to make something. And I feel like the reason for why we're making it is what we need to ask and have our students engage with. Why are you making something? What are you saying with what you're making? It's not enough that you lit it perfectly. It's not enough that you move the camera nicely. Like, we're past that. Because honestly, we can just do that on our phone right now. It'd be a lot easier. But the intention has to be there. So going back, sample, collect, resurrect found footage. I think that's really interesting. You think about the Black Family Archive. I think the usage of all of that footage, right? Like maybe our students could look back on what currently exists, right? And maybe think of ways of repurposing, remixing in intentional ways. Tell the story through any medium necessary, which I think is fascinating. This is the diary filmmaker's manifesto, but he's saying tell the story through any medium necessary, which makes me wonder, is film even truly a medium anymore if this is part of the filmmaker's manifesto? He said within the filmmaker's manifesto, you can tell it through any medium. So is this a medium anymore? It's a question again. That's the point of the zine. It's just a bunch of questions. We find the answers later. Or we find the answers by doing. So case study number 4 is a shift in directorial thinking. Aristotle Torres in volume 1 made this wonderful film called Story Ave with Luis Guzman and Asante Black. And Aristotle talked to us about basically, thinking about a color palette that is going to change from the beginning of the film to the end, thinking about shooting at a certain f-stop for the beginning and changing that, towards the end of the film. A very grounded kind of like traditional sense of how to shoot something. And I think it's interesting that in volume 2, we actually have a conversation with the DP that pretty much goes against that exact same notion of how to pre-visualize. So again, I like the idea of the conversations across volumes being in tension with each other, sort of like combating with each other. So Joe Mofrey, who shot All Dirt Roads Taste of Salt, shot Nickel Boys, which everybody should see. He talked about something really interesting. He said that instead of reading the script once and saying to the director, oh, this would look really great in anamorphic, or, I really think that we could do asymmetrical compositions. And maybe the movie starts out having a warm tone, but as the couple gets closer, the movie becomes colder. He says, I try to clear my mind of any of those kinds of cerebral thoughts, of me trying to define or even analyze or interpret what the movie is. Instead, I kind of wipe my brain clean and I talk to the director about why they're making the movie, why it's important to them, the emotions that they feel connected to, the emotions inside the script, the things that the characters are feeling. So it's interesting to see that Jomo's process is directly antithetical to the process that Aristotle was referring to in volume 1. Again, I'm not saying either person is right, but I do think the fact that there's divergence between these two, that's where we're going to find the truth, I think, as instructors. The more times that I can put myself in positions to find divergence between what I think is the way to make films and what the filmmakers in the zine are saying is the way to make films, the more times we can have diversion, I think the more we're going to be able to actually arrive at what cinema actually really is, I think, or what the medium really is, what a practice is, right? And I think ideally one day our students will stop asking, am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to do that? Because that's the question I really don't like. But I think they ask that because they think there's a set of rules. It doesn't mean that there are not, but I do think those rules are there to be questioned. Horizontalization, which feels like a pretentious term, but it is what it is. Khalik Allah was somebody that came and talked with us last year in volume 1. And I think one thing that I wanted to do with this zine was I wanted to make the presence of these people that the students were engaging with extend into the classroom. So like if you read an interview with somebody, later you can then question that person on what they said because they will come visit the classroom. I felt that was a different, and I felt a little bit more effective way than kind of the established way of kind of having guests visit us, which I think is fine. But I always felt like, what's the difference between a guest coming to visit our students and our students going to Lincoln Center and like watching the guests answer the same questions? I felt like if I could have our guests, exist in conversation with the students, have their practice really be questions, so to speak. I felt like that would be something that maybe would feel more meaningful and actually put our students and our guests on the same level. Because at the end of every talk, our guests are always like, here's my email, like reach out to me. And that, that's like an interesting posturing that kind of happens sometimes. But like, I feel like it's more interesting if we actually really put our money where our mouth is and actually put these filmmakers who are further along in their career on the same level, eye to eye, with filmmakers who are just starting. And I think that part of that is kind of breaking down hierarchy, so to speak. So this is Khalid coming to us after our students read his piece, which I thought was really good. And shout out to Siobhan Mizrahi, who was the powerhouse behind collaborating on bringing Khalid to speak with us. So I want to bring back the cover again. So if you look at these names here, right? This is volume 1. This is volume 2. Now you'll see there's 30 names here, and there's like, I don't know, 8 or whatever, 10, 12 names here. It doesn't mean that we interviewed more filmmakers, but it does mean that we included more people on the back. So the back of this cover has 3 Oscar-nominated filmmakers. It also has my mom, right? Like my mom wrote a poem, so she's on the cover with them, right? And I think that, like, to me, ideally, we can, in these kind of structural ways, just nudge us towards a little bit more humility, I think, which I think always want to strive for. But I think sometimes within these publications, within these things, there's certain kind of systemic ways of thinking that are just kind of embedded in how we even present information, how we even value or celebrate artists, that I think can start to be questioned a little bit through little gestures like this. I don't think it disrespects anybody, but I also think it asks the question. It's like, a lot of time filmmakers draw from this kind of material, right, to make great work. So why can't, a poem by a layperson like my mother exist in the same space as, an interview with a great Oscar-nominated filmmaker? So horizontalization, is part of the overall ethos. You'll notice that we have categories: visual art, poetry, interviews, something called the off-grid section. And the idea behind that is that all of this is cinema. So this is photography by Ashley Pena. This is paintings by Obi Agwam. This is a mixture of painting and sculpture by Oscar Morel. Oscar Morel said that the inspiration behind that painting on the right was Spike Lee's Do the Right Thing. He said, I wanted to make that as a painting. So it's like, to me, that's cinema, right? So if we're making a cinema zine, then we can include all these elements that contain cinema. And I think that someone was telling me the other day, they were like, well, what's the big deal? Like, yeah, cinema contains a lot of different art forms. Like, that's not a new idea. And I'm like, yeah, I'm not saying that's the point. The point is the manner in which it contains these art forms, the manner in which it embodies these art forms is what needs to be questioned, right? Because a lot of times it was like cinema, and then it's like painting, costume design, like almost like under that umbrella. But what if it's the other way around? What if sculpture, what if painting, what if costume design informs the way that we're making cinema as opposed to being dictated by cinema on how to exist? And that's sort of why we do it this way. Tracking a film movement in real time, getting towards the end here. Later today I'll fly to Dominican Republic to teach a workshop for a week that I do twice a year. And I'm in a unique position where I can exist in this ever-evolving movement that's very young by always tracking what's happening in Dominican cinema every time this zine comes out. So there's a little section that'll always exist, which is basically something related to Dominican cinema. Last year, we brought Nelson Carlo and Victoria Linares to NYU in collaboration with City College, which was really important considering that City College has a huge Dominican student demographic. And it was a great collaboration. And they came and spoke about their work. This year, Joel Morales, whose film Mad Bills to Pay was at Sundance, and also Joel Alfonso Vargas. Joel Morales made Bachata de Bionico. these two films, one on the end of the diaspora, one localized in DR, both are pretty important additions to the Dominican cinema ecosystem. And so we interviewed both of them. And for Joelle, we actually interviewed we had both the Spanish language text exists alongside the English language text, so that if somebody only speaks Spanish, they could benefit from reading this interview. So that'll be an exciting addition. That's what volume 2 is. That's what homesickness is. I think that what's more important actually to me, like I'm sort of sharing this with you, but it's a very rare opportunity for me to be able to like sit with colleagues, brilliant colleagues from NYU, like, people that I feel very humbled to even exist in the same space with. And oftentimes I'm putting this out into the world and like having it exist through action, but I don't get it, questioned or tested or, this is what's exciting about hopefully the last 15 minutes of this is I'd love to hear from you, to hear like, what do you think is missing here? What do you think is working here? What are your impressions of what this is? And, again, doing what hopefully homesickness does is what I think this is actually even what it is, so to speak. So yeah, I'd love to talk about it for the next, I think we have 10, 12 minutes left. So, but yeah, that's homesickness.
So I wanted to know, so homesickness, is that a formal part of the course? Like the students get a copy of the homesickness?
Yeah, and in my advanced class, they did get a copy of it. So yeah. And this year, I won't do that just because I don't think I think this homesickness is a little out there for my advanced class, so I don't know if it'll be as relevant, but the last one, there were just so many, we used it a lot as assignments. Because there's essays by filmmakers on other films, so one of the things our students did is we did a lot of supplemental assignments, so they would have to write certain essays on a film that was very important to them, or like I told you about like the playlist idea. And also I tried to program different interviews based off of where they were in the semester for something that would be pertinent to them. So if there was someone that spoke a lot about pre-production, I would try to set that up as a supplementary reading so that then they could write a response in engaging with that, and hopefully it would be relevant to what they're going through, because it's a year-long production class where they end up making a short film. And
then the others can access it, I guess, through like bookstores or? Yeah.
So we prioritize it as a print publication first and foremost to do that. And then after we sell out the print, then it's made available digitally. So the volume 1 will be soon available digitally because we sold out physically. And that's kind of how we do it. Yeah. But it's stocked at Iconic Magazine, Topos Bookstore, Arcana in LA, Bucket of Blood in Chicago. I think there's like 2 others in New York that I'm forgetting, but yeah.
I'm really curious because you mentioned it like a little bit offhand, but it's the thing I latched on to the most, which you called cinema like a practice, as opposed to and you were just riffing off of whatever cinema could be, and it's really interesting to me to see this combined into a zine, because I feel like a lot of these mediums are becoming less they're less mediums, and these are just questions that you've already been asking. It's they're less mediums through which to deliver a message, and more like a practice that you have in order to tell a kind of story, like a vibe of story that you're going through. So I'm curious as to because if you're looking at cinema as a practice, I'm almost curious as to why you wanted a zine to convey these broader, more esoteric ideas, because the zine is a very particular vibe and practice of doing this thing.
That's really interesting. I think to on a practical level, it's just for example, I'm doing development for my next feature now, and that's such a one-track minded way. It's just you don't have the space to think this way when you're preparing a film traditionally, right? It's so I was getting frustrated because I'd be all right, well, like I have to stay with this one narrative for like 2 to 3 years and find this actor and talk to these producers. And it's like, you're just on that the whole time. Meanwhile, cinema's happening. Like it's happening all the time. And so it's like, how do I like remain, because then how do I remain a fan of the medium? How do I remain somebody that believes in the medium if I'm only focused on my film for 2 to 3 years? Like the math is not going to add up. I'm going to become like, whatever, make 5 movies and then my life's over. Because like I just like dedicated it to these movies. So it's like you can't not make those movies, but what's something else that can happen where you're constantly engaged with what's happening with the medium? And so I was like, this is a fun way to do it, right? I felt like a publication, it's a good way to have conversation, have a feedback loop. Also, you start to be informed with this movie. It's a good way to like let that get jaded, because you can always mention it to people you talk to. I'm like, I'm making this movie. It's like, what do you think of this? And then there's like a new idea that you're like, oh, I never thought of it that way, right? So I think maybe that's why the zine is helpful. And zine is such an unthreatening thing. Like if it was like a book, I'd be like, I don't know, I can't do a book. I don't. But it's like, it's a zine, so it's like whatever. Yeah.
I just want to say I really appreciated in looking through the first copy that a lot of the writing was decided to be as Q&As, and from the writing, but also from your film perspective, a lot of us we exist in this very hyper-edit, like this way of like refining and editing things. But what I think I get more value out of reading in a lot of things, I want to hear that kind of flow of conversation, that someone isn't deciding what to pick something out of. So I look forward to reading it and feeling like that kind of openness.
Thank you. Yeah, it's the lack of finality, right? It's like life is actually in the present. We're always in process. We're never actually final. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you all. I think we're at time, right?
We are.
Yeah.
But I thank you so much, Alfonso.
Oh, okay, cool. Thanks. Thank you guys, seriously.